sitting on my doorstep, the people's passing by. They're coming back from getting wrecked. Everybody's high. Saturday night, what a bitch, laying on the lawn. The morning comes to bring the switch after the buzz is gone.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Addictions, the podcast about addictions. I'm your host, David Wagner. Today on the show we are going to continue our month-long efforts to help raise awareness about the growing issues in regard to addiction-related stigma. On this episode of the show, we are going to discuss one of the biggest issues in regard to this whole climate of negative stigma, and that is the fact that many people who struggle with addiction do so in silence, because they are afraid of being judged. And in a large number of cases, individuals often do not receive the help that they need, the help that they want, due to this negative stigma surrounding addiction. But first, I want to remind everyone that you can go back and listen to any episodes of the Addictions Podcast by visiting addictionspodcast.com. From there, you can find all kinds of links to all sorts of extras on the show, and you can find links to listen to the show on all of the major podcast apps like Google Play and Apple Podcasts. And if you really enjoy the show and want to help support the show, there's also a link on addictionspodcast.com to make one-time donations to the show through PayPal. Now, on with the show. On this episode, we are also going to feature an interview in the second half of the show with Andraya Jorgensen. Andraya is originally from the state of Michigan, and she's actually been traveling the United States recently, and she's actually now approaching 1 year in recovery from addiction. I believe April 26th, she will be celebrating her anniversary. Andraya tells us her story, so stay tuned for that. But first, the negative stigma that often comes with addiction is often enough to keep many people from reaching out and getting the treatment that they need. And we see this happening more and more over time. You know, there are many studies that I could rattle off and all sorts of statistics that prove this, but really the main thing we need to do desperately and to do better is to educate medical personnel and the general public to the fact that addiction is a chronic disease of the brain. And fortunately, it is a disease that can be treated, and treated successfully. And we can argue that people choose to become addicted to drugs by choosing to use drugs in the first place. But this would be speaking from a lot of assumptions, and it's just not true most of the time. Sure, some people do just simply choose to start using drugs, but in many cases, people often start out on prescriptions as directed by their doctors, and through no abuse to the drugs, develop a physical and psychological dependence to the drugs. So every case is different, but we're kind of veering away from the big point here. We need to better educate everyone about the fact that addiction is a disease, and that in some cases, yes, choice is involved, but not in all cases. And even if choice is involved, that does not make addiction any less of a disease. I mean, if you chose to have an unhealthy diet and eat a bunch of just terrible food that's just nutritionally devastating all the time, and you develop diabetes or heart disease, these are things that are still diseases, even though choice can be involved. But yet, the biggest argument from many people who choose to perpetuate the negative stigma surrounding addiction is this, and that is that addiction is a choice. And this argument simply holds no water at all. It's full of holes. There's no evidence for this, and actually it's quite the contrary, the opposite. We actually have evidence that supports that addiction is a disease. But I think that first and foremost, we need to change the dialogue about what it really means to have addiction issues And we really need to increase the evidence-based treatments. These are things that have a proven track record of success, like medication replacement therapy, things like Suboxone. But this means putting an end to this negative stigma and increasing access to medication that really can help treat opioid abuse disorders. We also need to expand the support of expanded use of the life-saving overdose reversal drug naloxone, or Narcan. We need to really hammer the fact home that people facing addiction simply deserve to be treated like any other patient with any other medical disease. And the sad fact of the matter is that even beyond the general public, even in some healthcare settings, a negative stigma towards those with addiction problems is often very prevalent. And this is not to say that there are organizations out there that simply do not and have absolutely no interest in perpetuating this negative stigma. Actually, an organization right here in Michigan that I firmly stand behind is Work at Health. And at Work at Health, the staff really care about and treat patients the way that patients should be treated. Be sure to check out their webpage at workathealth.com. And, having organizations like this with this type of philosophy is definitely a step in the right direction in regard to reducing the negative stigma barrier to getting treatment. The things I was just talking about are all really great steps to begin reducing the negative stigma surrounding addiction. But one thing that we can all do as individuals, and over time can have a really large ripple effect, is to break the silence. If you witness someone belittling another for having issues with addiction, maybe say something. Maybe explain calmly and collected that addiction is a disease and in many cases choice may not have been involved. This can be a difficult thing to do, but I urge all of the listeners to fight the good fight and stand up for what is right. Together we can truly reduce this negative stigma related to addiction. Now let's go ahead and switch gears and listen in on a conversation that I had the other day with Andraya Jorgensen about her experience after about a year in recovery. Andraya's story of addiction and recovery is really quite interesting, so without further ado, here we go. Okay, today on the show we are speaking with Andraya Jorgensen. She is coming up on 1 year of being in recovery from addiction. Now, Andraya, you were addicted to, I believe you told me in the email it was methamphetamine?
Yeah, that was I kind of tried. I did substitution. I was never one that really mixed a lot of things. So it was things before that, but that was the thing in the end that got me. And that was the biggest and worst one, obviously.
Okay. Now, in the email that you sent to me, I thought it was kind of unique. You had kind of an alternate living sort of lifestyle going on now. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. So that's kind of what I'm moving towards. So I went to college and I got a degree in environmental studies, and it was kind of one of those degrees that my brother went to art school, and it was he kind of felt the same thing where it was like, this is a passion, but like, what do I do with this?
Yeah.
And so one thing that I got out of that was just wanting to kind of like farm, but also live alternatively in small spaces and just definitely not conventional living, and try to minimize my impact on the environment and just see where that could go. So when I first got out of college, at that point, I just kind of was, during college, and even when I got out, I was like smoking weed every day, and drinking a lot. But I still kind of had my head on straight, kind of relatively. So I got out of college and I just kind of wanted to travel. So I started, just moving. I'm from Michigan. I went to college in Chicago. So I just kind of wanted to go west. And I lived out of a backpack, because I didn't have a car at the time, and I was just farming on different organic farms. So I was living in trailers on people's property or out of a backpack in a small tent. And then I was in an eco village in Missouri for a little bit, but then I got my car. So one of the farms I landed on was one in Arizona, and they were a really new startup. And that is where I got introduced to meth. And I didn't know what I was getting myself into. I never really heard of it or thought about it or anything. And I was still like thinking that I was in the like experimentation phase. And so I kind of started with meth and treated it like weed, which I was doing
Yeah.
all day, every day. And that, that was like not a good idea. um, so, so yeah, so I went downhill. Well, to get back to the alternative living thing, so there's a chunk there that I just kind of, the meth took over, which we can talk about. But now into the recovery, I'm kind of getting those values back of wanting to. The dream really is to take like a school bus or a van and convert that into a living space.
Oh, that would be awesome.
Obsessively, yeah, exactly. Like with solar on top, and I've been obsessively watching YouTube channels of people that are doing this, and it's just inspiring. But I also am in a place where I'm right on the fence where I'm like, that's where I'm headed. But also like, I just get these like doubtful moments where I'm like, God, I can't do it. Like I can't get there. And I think that's still the addict in me that wants the instant gratification is like, this is what I want to do. So I want it now. And it's like, I have to work for it, but yeah, so that's kind of where that is. Like the long-term goal is to have like build a tiny house and be, living off grid and farming. But, the medium goal to kind of find, because part of my travel, I don't really know where I want to land yet. I haven't found a place that I want to really be. So I want to have a school bus or a van and kind of do what I was doing before, work on farms and travel and see where I'll land.
Yeah, that sounds awesome. Definitely.
Yeah.
I told you earlier in text message, my ex-girlfriend and I, we've many times we've looked into the whole kind of living on the road sort of lifestyle, and it's, I don't know why, but it's just really appealing to me, I mean.
Exactly, yeah.
But then I'm kind of torn because part of me is really deep roots here in Michigan, but I mean, it's not like I would never come back.
Right, yeah.
It sounded like to me in the email that you sent me that you were kind of concerned with being in recovery and going back into that sort of lifestyle, and
definitely,
whether or not it was healthy or whether or not it was something you were able to do. But then, like you mentioned, you find out that your roommates have had drugs in the house or whatever. No matter where you're at geographically, you're never that far away from the temptation. It's going to be there, so you might as well set these goals and just do what you want to do,
And that's kind of what I found. So to jump back to that chunk that I was talking about. So I was when I got to that farm in Arizona, I only planned to be there a week or two. I wanted to go to one in California, but I ended up staying there. I kind of liked the small town, but also the meth drew me in. And I don't know, there's a bunch of reasons why I just kind of got stuck in this place. I was there for a winter, and then I went back to Michigan and I bought my car and then drove it back to Arizona. And part was because I had started like dating the guy next door who had just gotten out of jail. And I also had never dealt with the jail or like any of, I hadn't really, definitely a lot of the negative repercussions like hadn't hit me yet,
Yeah.
And so I got involved with this guy that was not in a good place. And so basically I bought my car and then just drove it back to Arizona. And by this time, the farm that I was working on, one of the male owner there, Victor, he had died. And so his wife, I think, was moving to California. So that kind of was in shambles. So I was going back to Arizona basically because like there's this guy there and like, I don't know, there's drugs. And so I was there. I found a dog in Arizona right before I got back to that town. I found him on the Navajo reservation under some stairs.
Oh.
And he was just like, I named him Bear, and he was amazing. He was so smart. He was an Aussie mix. He was just my pride and joy. He was the first dog that I had on my own. And so I went back to the town in Arizona and I had this dog, and things fell through with that guy, but I still like lived there. I ended up I kind of jumped from houses to houses. This is where like negative stuff starts to come in. So I started to kind of get kicked out of houses. So I was living on this ranch, renting a room. And I remember I came home one day and all of my stuff was just out in the driveway and Bear was just running around and they were like, you have like drugs in the house, get out. But at the time, like in retrospect, I'm like, okay, like that was like right of like, that was okay of them. Like that's understandable. But at the time I was like, okay, whatever. Like that's like, it didn't really hit that there was consequences for what I was doing. I still was like, what I'm doing is what I'm doing. So whatever. And so I moved in with a friend in town. And she was renting the house from one of her friends. And we stayed there for the whole winter and we were using a lot. And then we both got kicked out of that house. And I ended up buying a travel trailer that I moved into. The woman I was living with, her name was Linda, she moved into her car. And I moved into a travel trailer that I bought. And the thing also about this town is that it's really tiny, like 200 or 300 people. It's like an hour and a half from Vegas, but it's a very, very, very small town.
Yeah.
So I moved into this travel trailer, and then I just basically got kind of crazy tweaking on it, and it was perfectly fine when I bought it. I bought it for $500, and it was perfectly working. But I just started tearing the thing apart, and I mean, a lot of that was fueled by the mess. I just wanted to just break things and then rebuild them, but not actually get around to the rebuilding part.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, I still was kind of holding on to a lot of my old dreams with that trailer. Like I kind of have a design mind. And so I have notebooks full of like how I was going to design it and because I did want to rebuild it. My brain wasn't in a place to be able to actually follow through with that,
Exactly.
Yeah. So that happened. And then I met another guy in that town, and that's just when things went bad. So up until this point, I had just been like smoking it. And this guy, his grandma lived in town, and he was from, Utah, and his grandma had brought him to this town because he had been living in his truck in Salt Lake, just off heroin. And so his grandma brought him here to try to like clean him up or whatever.
Yeah. A change of geography.
Exactly. Kind of thing. Yeah. And he was one who he didn't want to kick the heroin on his own. He liked to use meth to kick it.
Yeah.
And so I met him by him being like, I'm like trying to get off the heroin binge. Like, do you know where I can get meth? And I was like, yeah, I'm going there right now. And also so the hard drugs were never really something I had experienced or thought about. So when he came up and was like, oh, I'm getting off heroin, I didn't know it. Like that didn't register any thoughts or feelings or emotions, or I had no idea what, so this was like, cool, okay, that's what you're doing. And so then he wanted to go to Utah to get his truck. So I drove him to Utah. This was 2 summers ago, and ended up just staying in Utah. We were living out of my car and his truck. That's the summer that he introduced me to shooting. And things just went so far down.
Yeah.
Really, yeah. Go ahead.
I think a lot of people can really, a lot of people who have been through addiction can definitely relate to a lot of the stuff that you're talking about. Mm-hmm. I mean, the house to house moving around kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Even myself, to a degree, things were never all that incredibly stable, for a very long period of time anyways. It would seem like the bottom would always drop out, or I was just waiting for it to,
Yeah, definitely.
But yeah, continue on.
Yeah. Well, so that's interesting that you're saying that, because that wasn't that big of a shock to me. I kind of decided when I left college that I wasn't going to like live too conventionally, especially right away. And I wasn't necessarily going to be stable. So even when we went to Utah and we were living out of our cars, I was like, cool, this is fine. I lived out of my car the summer I bought it before the Met, so like, that was like, it didn't really hit me how bad things were, or how like, that this was just a weird decision or weird thing to be making, until maybe it started recovery or until things got really bad. So at the end of that summer, like I said, I had never been arrested, never dealt with any of that. And we were going, we had camped one night, and then the next day we were going to go to Moab. We had the whole like change of geography to just set things straight. And we're going to go to Moab to start our new life, and it was going to be awesome. And we're driving back. We were in his truck, and we were driving back to my car and to pick it up to go there. And we got stopped.
Oh, wow.
I was sleeping. Yeah. But I think he said that he hit a construction cone and someone called him in. But she had like a big old Chevy truck. It was loud and really hard to drive.
Yeah. Yeah.
But also, like, we were in a bad place, and, like, we were using. That night, thankfully, I always knew where the bag was. I never forgot it, but for some reason that night I had left it in my car. And so that morning and that night was like a big fight. Like, I can't believe you always know where they were. And I was like, I remember I left them in my car. And then the next morning, we got stopped, and it was a fresh 8-ball that we would have got stopped with.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Yeah. So that was like lucky, kind of.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So we ended up going. At first, they said on his sobriety test that he didn't pass, but he didn't fail. But they wanted to take him in, and so they drew his blood, and it meth and heroin and Xanax were still in it. So that was his like third DUI, so it was a felony DUI for him.
Oh, wow.
And as far as I know, yeah, he's still on the run for that. So, and I got a paraphernalia charge. I had needles, I had a pipe, I had all that stuff.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I never really dealt with any of that. But that's when things just, after that, it couldn't, you want to say it couldn't get worse, but it could until you decide to change it, So,
yeah, exactly.
So, we just kind of, I bailed myself out because it was my first charge and it wasn't that much money. And I got a bondsman to get him out because his bail was so much. And then maybe a month after that, I went to court, I got probation. And I was doing that. I went to probation, and I actually, so before I had my first probation appointment, the dog there, we used to just let him run out in the back roads, and my ex was driving my car, and he hit him with my car.
Oh, no.
And he died, yeah.
Oh, bummer.
And he was 15 months old, and so, yeah, that was,
I'm so sorry.
devastating. Yeah, thank you. And so, for some reason, the night that happened, I had tried to quit like so many times, we all do that. But that night I quit cold turkey. I remember taking him to the emergency vet. They couldn't save him. And so I just like quit cold turkey for a month. And so my first month of probation, I was like clean and I was doing well.
Yeah.
But he was not, he was kind of just like suffering from all the like the guilt and the trauma of like that happening.
Yeah.
And so, and he was using more than ever, and I was funding his use, which was, our relationship was beyond strained at this point, but, and so then he was using heroin, and he wanted to try to stop, at least that's what he was saying, but it was too expensive without insurance. And he remembered that he had insurance in Arizona. So we went back to Arizona because he found a bed at a detox place, but we stopped in that small town in Arizona before we went to the detox, which was in Phoenix.
Yeah.
And we were going to stay at his grandma's house for a night, and we stayed there for 5 months. And I relapsed, and it was just bad.
Yeah.
And so in last April, around this time, so at this point, he was still running from the bondsman and from all of his legal stuff. And so and also during this winter, we had like broke up and then gotten back together so many times. And there was a time we broke up, and then like a week later, I saw him again, and then we went to pick up in town, like a half an hour away. And on the way back, his grandma calls us and is like, "Don't come back. The bondsman is here looking for you guys." And so then we're on the run again. And we were in Vegas out of the cars. And this was just really, really like the worst month. We were in Vegas living out of my car, and we just were completely on the rocks with ourselves and each other. And then he just left. And I was alone for a little while. And then I was like, this is just bullshit. Like, this is not working. This isn't okay. My mom had kind of started to get involved. My mom didn't know a lot of any of what was going on, but when I got arrested, because I didn't have an address outside of her house, because I just had been traveling. So when I got arrested, a letter came to her house in Michigan, and that was pretty much the first she heard of any of this. She called, and
kind of out of the
"What
blue."
is going on?" Exactly, yeah. And so then, the end of April, when she kind of helped to get involved, I went to a rehab on the Western Slope in Colorado, in a town called Crawford, and then started recovery.
Wow, that's quite the tale. I mean, but so much of what you say, I can really relate to. I mean, it's a different. I was into opioids,
Yeah.
but addiction is addiction is addiction.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's the thing about it. It's one of the big reasons I started the podcast was that, so that as recovering addicts, we can tell our stories like this, and because like for me, I don't know about you, but like for me, it can be hard to begin talking about it. But once I start talking, it's incredibly
especially
therapeutic.
With people who understand. Yeah. And so that's part of what I'm struggling with now. So, like you mentioned, April 26th is my year sobriety date.
Great job. It's coming up.
Thank you. Yeah. And so where I'm at now, I'm living on the Front Range. I'm living in Denver. I was in that rehab for 3 months. And then I worked there for 3 months. I was like a ranch hand.
Yeah.
So she kind of was, the director was kind of trying to pair me with what my degree was. So she worked a lot with sustainability and gardening and all that type of stuff. So that was kind of what my internship was.
Yeah, that's cool.
And so I did that for a little bit. But I also think in retrospect, I wasn't really in a place to totally grasp onto that opportunity. And so I was there for 3 months, and then I kind of bailed on that. And I've been living in Denver since the beginning of December. And it's challenging to find community. It really, really is. So the rehab I went to was not 12-step based. It wasn't at all. It was a lot of kind of like getting back into your body, like mind body stuff, PTSD stuff. And it like substance abuse is what it helped to treat, but also it works from the parameters that a lot of substance abuse stems from trauma. So
yeah.
I also lost my dad when I was young. And so there's just stuff like that it kind of, so it healed the substance abuse, or it works to it, but it also is more of a holistic approach of like, this is, like trauma is a big part of it.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to go about it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, because like trauma really is a big part of it. And
you
might not even think that you have been traumatized, but
exactly.
if you really look, there's
it's like almost
usually
a part of the
something
human
there.
experience.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah. This life can chew you up and spit you out fairly easily. Mm-hmm. It really can.
Yeah. And that's also not something that we're necessarily talking about, I think, in recovery, but even just in mainstream culture, or like, like we're taught, like you see anyone, like whether it's a stranger, an acquaintance, it's like, how are you? You just say good automatically, we're not really taught to be like, this is actually what's going on. And like about being vulnerable and open about those things is very like the birthplace of courage and creativity and connection and community and all these awesome things.
Definitely.
But like just on the day to day, like, where do you get the chance to even express those things or like see that? You know?
And it's like we all know about it, but nobody wants to say anything about it, kind of thing, almost.
And yeah, exactly. And the more you like compound those feelings of like inadequacy or anything like the trauma or just anything that kind of that pain, like when you kind of step into your pain and feel it, like I think it's the birthplace of real growth and of it's kind of where the light shines through. But when you don't talk about it, or when you don't even acknowledge it in your own self, then you compound it in your body, and then you like express it in road rage or substance abuse or whatever it is.
It'll definitely come through at some point.
Mm-hmm.
It's like water; it takes the path of least resistance, and
exactly
one way or another, it's gonna get out.
Yeah, so that's been a hard thing living in Denver. I've been here almost 5 months, and the community and finding community is hard. So 12-step hasn't really been my approach. That was kind of why, even when I started to realize that something was wrong and I needed to like recover or do something differently.
Yeah.
The 12-step had always turned me off.
Yeah.
I know.
Same here.
My dad. he died when I was 10. And I had thought up until last December that I knew he was an alcoholic, but he had only drank for the last like 2 years of his life. And that doesn't kill an alcoholic that quick, you know?
Yeah.
And so something wasn't adding up there. And I didn't find out until December of last year. I was talking to my brother. So I got diagnosed with hepatitis C. And
Okay.
when I was talking to my brother about it, he was like, yeah, that's what Dad died from. And my
Oh, wow.
dad had been shooting heroin in his 20s, and I had no idea. And so it's crazy how that happened. The hep, somehow I got diagnosed, but then when they did more blood work, I was good. So either it was a false positive the first time, or my body fought it off on its own, which was a major, major blessing.
Yeah, definitely.
But yeah, so with that, yeah. So the 12 steps. So my dad, when he was drinking a lot, I remember being young and my mom trying to take him to AA meetings, and it's just not working. It just wasn't really my scene. And so, and then the rehab I went to wasn't 12-step based. So finding a community in Denver is hard. Like, I've never had to do this whole, like, I'm like sober and trying to like grow and like, you know, like do this self-growth thing and create a life I want to live. And like, how do I find people that can relate to that and that are a good environment for that, you know? And it's hard. And so, yeah, so that's where I'm at with that. And also, like you said, one of my roommates I went to rehab with, and the other one is her friend from before rehab. And yeah, it's just not a good environment. And so definitely struggling to figure out what the next steps are and how to like make dreams happen, I think.
Well, I would say that you're on the right path, Andrea. Definitely.
Thank you.
What would you say that going into rehab has helped you with the most?
I mean, so the tools that they gave me there were really powerful. So a big one was just being able to feel safe in my body again. You know,
Yeah.
after the trauma of losing my dad, and then even just growing up, I remember being in like middle school and high school and just feeling so inadequate and like hating myself and like just being like so miserable. And I think that's an experience that a lot of us have at that age. But I didn't have an outlet to like express this is what I was feeling. And so I just compounded it and it turned ugly. So, I think I got a lot of tools as how to, I mean, there's a lot of work, on like finding my value and also I think it's like loving yourself in the end, which is a lifelong, like, I don't want to say battle, but, journey.
Yeah.
But then a lot of it was just like literally coming back to my senses. Like when I'm like triggered, whether it's emotionally or by, you know, a substance around or whatever, it's like do deep breathing and like, what am I thinking? Like get back in my body rather than like jumping out, you know? And that's just like the basic foundational skills. I think that it's like a lifelong journey to figure out how to live the way that you're meant to, you know?
Definitely. And
yeah.
you know, today we almost live in like a throwaway kind of society, and
yeah,
it's kind of sad that it's, you know, a lot of people don't get the right tools,
exactly.
or the right knowledge, you know, starting out, you know, to avoid these types of things. It's unfortunate, but you know, life is a journey, and we're constantly learning and changing all the time. I mean, almost on a daily basis when you really, really think about it.
Oh, definitely. And I think that change can be like intentional, or it can just be unconscious, you know? So when you're not conscious about how you're acting or what you're seeing or what you're taking in or how you're thinking or any of those things, then it's shaped by what society wants or by what like advertising wants or any of these things. And you can never measure up to that, you know? And so it's really taking the time to like be with yourself and be like, I am worthy and I am valuable and I am good enough. And like, I need to take care of myself and create the life that I want.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, and you also mentioned in the email, talking about being in recovery and being on the road.
Mm-hmm.
One thing you could think about doing would be to kind of like document the whole thing. You know, do some filming and do some like audio journaling while you're doing it. You know.
Yeah, Yeah.
keep track of your recovery that way, and
Hmm. Yeah.
share it with the world. You know.
Exactly. That's really encouraging and really awesome that you say that, because so also where the idea comes from. So my other time on the road, I was in either like active addiction but not too far in, and then in like the depths of addiction. And
Yeah.
so it's kind of scary to think of, yeah, going on the road and living. I remember when I was in rehab, one of the life coaches, I was talking to her about wanting to go back on the road, and I remember her being like, you shouldn't like do that. Like that's just asking to go back to what you were. And now I've kind of grown in the past couple months where I'm like, I feel stronger in my recovery, and I'm like, I think that it's valuable, and that won't necessarily have, obviously I have to be diligent and keep on with growth. But the other thing is interesting, you were saying to record it, because I was talking to one of the other life coaches at the place just a couple of weeks ago, and I've been watching all these YouTube channels of people who are traveling in their vans, who are feeding the homeless, who are doing these awesome things. And I was like, it's scary, because I am a photographer, but I don't have much video knowledge or editing or any of that. But I was thinking of doing like a YouTube channel of like recovery on the road. And I remember when I
Definitely.
told her that, she was like, I got chills. Like, that's a really, really awesome idea. So I don't know. We'll look out for that.
With the age of smartphones and stuff now, I mean, it's almost, I mean, anybody can do it. You know, you don't
Mhm.
really necessarily have to have a deep knowledge of filmmaking
Yeah.
anymore,
Yeah.
which is fantastic. I mean, yeah, there's a lot of crap out there too, but it's great that anyone can do it now.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's highly accessible. Just
Yeah.
pull out your phone.
Mhm.
Now, one thing I did want to talk to you about before we kind of wrap things up, Andrea, was this whole month on the Addictions podcast, we've been talking a little bit about the negative stigma that surrounds addiction. While you were in active addiction or even during recovery, did you ever witness or feel that negative stigma in any way?
Yeah. Oh, definitely, definitely, definitely. I in active addiction, there's countless examples. A lot. I think you've mentioned this before when you were talking with other guests, but it's from medical professionals. I remember maybe like a month before I went into rehab, I remember the guy was not with me anymore, and I was on my own. And I went to an ER in Boulder City, Nevada, and they just were like, so whatever, like they were not listening to what I was saying was wrong. And then I remember, so I had been living in the cars. Basically, they weren't listening to my medical concerns, and then they were like, so you can go take a shower on like this other floor. And then I came back down after they had just told me to go take a shower, and they were like, we need to test your pee. And of course they weren't saying like you're strung out, but
Yeah,
like obviously, and I could just feel that they were like not
judging
helpful at
you.
all.
Yeah,
Yeah. And so I don't even know how many examples of that
definitely.
during active addiction. We bought a truck that I was going to fix up. I like to work on cars and kind of just be able to know the things that I use, whether it's food or vehicles or whatever. So we bought a
Yeah.
truck that I was trying to fix up, and we couldn't get it working in time. And so the guy ended up selling it to someone else. And so we had to get this detective. It was kind of this thing. And the guy who he sold it to was saying that he didn't want to give us the money that we paid for it back, because he had seen like needles and stuff in like
Oh,
in our
no
trash,
shit.
and like, yeah, like being really like horribly rude about it. Um and then even just last week I tried to go with my roommate to donate plasma.
Yeah.
And they were really nice. I didn't know this was a thing, but if you've been an IV drug user, you can't do that. Yeah, so apparently I don't know if it was just the one I was at, but I had been sitting there for maybe a half hour, an hour filling out all the paperwork, and then I go in and they're showing me this video, and one of the first or second or third slides says like you can't donate if you are like currently or ever have been an IV drug user. And so I was just straight and was like, yeah, I've done that. And they just automatically switched. Like these two girls that were there, they're like, okay, we're like, you have to go talk to the nurse. And that they brought me to a different room, and the nurse was like, yeah, so we're going to permanently defer your like application. And the other guy was like, stay strong. It's just their energy completely changed. And they
Yeah.
were basically like, get out. Like, what are you doing here? Like, yeah, so definitely, definitely have felt that. Yeah, and it's hard.
Yeah, it
Because
is.
you're just a human too, you know, like especially going through what I've gone through in my recovery of realizing where a lot of these issues come from. A lot of it is trauma, just doing a lot of self work to figure out where this stuff came from. Like it's like we all have our things, and
Definitely.
like why are you so you know? Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
It blows me away because, number one, you don't know what led this person to get to this point in the first place.
Exactly.
And to judge them so harshly just because on assumptions, I mean,
Mhm.
it just seems highly illogical and
Yeah.
just stupid. I mean,
It just like completely lacks compassion
yeah,
and like empathy for the fact that we're all going through our things, you know, and we all have a voice. And like when you're like stripped of that compassion and when you're not made to feel like a human being, that's when it's like, why even try? Like, you know, like why is even like any of this like being a human worth it? If like you can't see me as a human just because of this decision I'm making, which is like a cry for help, you know? It's like,
exactly. Yeah. And
yeah.
I mean, there's people that will avoid getting help
Mhm.
because they're stigmatized.
Mhm.
And that right there is just messed up.
Yeah, and that well, so even when I was getting help, I went to so like I said, I had been on probation, and when I went to Arizona, I had like left the state without my probation officer's permission.
Okay.
But I had been compliant until that point, so she was pretty understanding when I finally got a hold of her. And I was trying to go to like a counseling center because part of my probation was that I had to like do counseling or you know that sort of thing. And so I was trying to go to a counseling place in Arizona, and even the counseling place. Now that you're saying like not getting help, they were like that too. I was still kind of a mess then. I ended up going when I first talked to the therapist, like I just remember feeling so judged. Like I was telling my story and I remember one thing he was telling about from going to college and all this and he was like, that's a far fall and I was like, cool, thanks. Like I know that. Like, you know. And then when I went to go to the first like I had to do group class things, I totally messed that up. I was strung out, it was bad. And they took my keys but they were just so judgy. They weren't like, okay, this is like something that is happening right now. Let's see how we can help you. They're just like, okay, we're going to take your keys and like you like mess this up. Like that's it, you know? And it was just, yeah.
Yeah,
And so I didn't try to
discouraging.
get help.
Yeah. Yeah.
Exactly. So I didn't try to get help for months after that until I basically felt like I had no other option.
Wow. Yeah. One thing that I ask all of my guests, most of my guests, if you could give, advice to anybody who's currently in active addiction and, maybe on the fence about going to rehab or just worried and looking for advice, what would it be?
Oh goodness. I mean, I remember it like it was yesterday, being in that place of feeling so fearful and alone, and just having this hole that nothing could fix. Didn't matter how much dope I used, how much clothes I tried to buy, didn't matter how much sex I had, didn't matter anything. But there's this gaping hole. And I remember still trying to hold on to who I was before that, like when I was living in the car, when I was building the trailer, being like, this is what I was, and still grasping onto that, but not feeling like I had it. And so oh goodness, I think that it's important to realize that you have worth, that each one of us has worth and value, and what you're going through needs to be validated first by yourself, but then by others too. Um, and that no matter how far it feels like you've lost yourself or that you've never even found it, like you're still in there. There's still divinity inside of you. That's what your soul is. That's what keeps fighting, and you're worth it. And when you make the decision that you're worth it and that you have value, things start to things start to change. It's magic, but it takes work also. It's not something that happens overnight, and it's not something that is easy. It's simple, but it's simple doesn't necessarily mean easy. So yeah, um, you're worth it and you got this, I think.
That's
I don't know.
fantastic advice, Andrea. I mean,
Thank you.
really, really good. I can't thank you enough for coming on the show and sharing your story. You know, I know that tons of people are going to be able to really relate to what you've been through.
Thank you. No, thank you. Yeah, it's really cool to be a guest, and also it's awesome and crazy that I know I just said that, you know, we all have value, but it's nice to be reminded. It's nice that my story isn't going on deaf ears here. It's really nice. Yeah.
That's what this is all about. You know, and keep us updated on the whole possible traveling and filming or recording or whatever.
Yeah.
We'd love to have you back on as a guest in the future if that's something you were going to do, or
definitely
whatever you're going to do.
That would be amazing. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Well, thanks again, Andrea. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Okay, so there we have it. Once again, I want to thank Andraya Jorgensen for being so brave and sharing her story with us here on the Addictions Podcast. Again, I'm your host, David Wagner, and I just want to remind you all once again that you can find all sorts of new features and updates at our website, which is www.addictionspodcast.com. We are actually going to be posting a new page on the website where we're going to be listing some resources for things like meditation and this type of stuff. So stay tuned for that. And be sure to follow us on Facebook and Twitter. You can find us on Facebook at facebook.com/addictionspodcast. And on Twitter, our handle is @addictionscast or twitter.com/addictionscast. As always, I want to thank you all so much for listening. And remember, never quit quitting.
When you smashed your only car, you aren't what you are really. You missed it by so damn far. Your head feels like it's in a blender, and you hate to see the dawn. Your stomach says return to sender after the buzz is gone. Your Sundays you prayed Uncle John. You poisoned yourself last night. Mary slapped your friend Tom. You got in a hell of a fight. Monday comes and it's back to work. The week seems so damn long. Weekends past, you're still a jerk after the buzz is gone.